The deadliest military strategy nobody saw coming. You're sitting in a warm house scrolling through your phone, probably imagining that the greatest military victories in history were won by brilliant generals leading fearless soldiers into glorious battles. But the real answer is far stranger. Again and again, history reveals that the deadliest military strategy wasn't the one that won the most dramatic battle. It was the one that made sure the enemy never had a chance to fight at full strength in the first place. Throughout history, armies have relied on one thing above all else: supplies, food, water, weapons, horses, roads, money. Without them, even the strongest empire could collapse. Take the Roman Empire. Its legions were among the finest fighting forces the ancient world had ever seen. Their discipline was legendary, and their engineering skills allowed them to conquer vast territories. But Rome didn't expand simply because its soldiers were brave. It expanded because it mastered logistics. Roman roads stretched for thousands of kilometers, allowing troops, food, and equipment to move faster than almost any rival. Those roads became the empire's invisible weapon. Yet history has a cruel sense of irony. The same logistical systems that made Rome powerful also became its greatest vulnerability. As the empire grew larger, defending distant frontiers became increasingly expensive. Supply routes stretched farther and farther. Local rebellions, invasions, and economic crises placed enormous strain on the empire's ability to feed and pay its armies. Eventually, maintaining the military machine became almost impossible. The battlefield wasn't where Rome truly began to lose. The collapse started behind the front lines. Centuries later, another conqueror learned a similar lesson the hard way. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Russia with the Grande Armée, one of the largest military forces Europe had ever seen. More than 500,000 soldiers crossed the border, expecting a decisive campaign. Instead, they found empty towns. Russian forces repeatedly withdrew, leaving little behind. Crops disappeared, food stores vanished, villages were abandoned or destroyed. Every kilometer Napoleon advanced made it harder to feed his army. Then came winter. Cold temperatures, disease, starvation, and exhaustion devastated the French forces. By the time the survivors returned, only a fraction of the original army remained. Historians still debate the exact numbers, but they agree on one point: far more soldiers died from hunger, disease, and exposure than from direct combat. It wasn't one spectacular battle that destroyed Napoleon's army. It was the slow collapse of everything that kept an army alive. The same pattern appeared during World War II. When people think about that conflict, they often imagine tanks, fighter planes, and massive battles. But behind every tank stood factories producing steel. Behind every soldier stood farmers growing food. Behind every aircraft stood thousands of workers building engines, fuel systems, and spare parts. Modern war became a contest of entire economies. Industrial production often mattered just as much as battlefield success. Countries capable of replacing equipment, training new soldiers, and maintaining transportation networks gained enormous advantages over time. Military historians frequently describe logistics as the backbone of every campaign. Without fuel, tanks become motionless metal. Without ammunition, artillery falls silent. Without food, even elite soldiers lose their strength. But perhaps the most surprising fact is this: for most of human history, disease has killed more soldiers than weapons. Ancient armies had little understanding of bacteria or viruses. Crowded camps became breeding grounds for infection. Clean drinking water was rare. Medical care was primitive. During long campaigns, illness could spread faster than any enemy attack. Entire armies weakened before reaching the battlefield. Weather played its part too. Heavy rain transformed roads into rivers of mud. Heat exhausted soldiers long before battle began. Frozen rivers stranded supply wagons. Mountains delayed reinforcements. The environment constantly reminded armies that they were never fighting only each other. They were also fighting geography. When you read about famous battles, it's easy to imagine that victory depended entirely on courage or tactical genius. But the real story is much more complicated. Behind every victory were thousands of cooks, engineers, blacksmiths, farmers, medics, wagon drivers, sailors, and laborers whose names were never recorded. Most of history's greatest military achievements were built on ordinary people doing extraordinary work far from the battlefield. That's why historians today often study supply records, roads, ports, warehouses, and agriculture just as carefully as they study generals. These forgotten details reveal how civilizations truly survived or failed. And perhaps that's the strangest lesson of all. The deadliest military strategy wasn't always the most dramatic, it wasn't the loudest, it wasn't even the bloodiest battle. More often, history was shaped by invisible forces, food supplies running out, economies collapsing, diseases spreading, harsh winters arriving, and ordinary people struggling to keep entire societies functioning. When those foundations disappeared, even the mightiest armies could do little to stop history from changing direction. So the next time you watch a movie about legendary battles or hear the story of a famous conqueror, remember this. The fate of empires was often decided long before the first sword was drawn or the first cannon fired. Because in the end, history's deadliest weapon wasn't always found on the battlefield. Sometimes it was everything happening behind it.